Many will know the name Arminius. Sometimes people say Armenian as if it had to do something with the country of Armenia, but that's really not right. This is about the Dutch theologian James Arminius, or Jacobus Arminius, who lived from 1559 to 1608 in the Netherlands. When I was a student, a theology student, first of all in Nazarene colleges and then later in the Nazarene Seminary and in doctoral studies at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, we used in those days the expression Wesleyan Arminian theology. That hyphenated expression has largely disappeared, and the need for being reminded about Arminius has come to the fore for me in my teaching classes in seminary for especially the last decade. Now, as a historian teaching stuff about Wesley or teaching stuff about our tradition, it's always been important to me to remind people about Arminius. I remember Mildred Banks Wynkoop's little book that was done, little book called Foundations of Wesleyan Arminian Theology, which, unless it's very recently gone out of print, has remained in print with the Nazarene Publishing House. This is a book that I have bought, I'm going to guess, maybe 3 or 4 dozen copies of, and given away mostly to Methodist ministers in the last 20 years because I've been teaching in the United Methodist context. And they come back to me over and over again and say, finally, for the first time, I actually understand where our Wesleyan tradition gets its understandings and its roots. So for the first time, it began to make sense to me. Now, this has come to the fore again in the last decade for my students, and a lot of my student pastors, especially in seminary, are dealing with what we call the New Calvinism. The New Calvinism, in my mind, is really just the old Calvinism warmed over in a North American kind of flavor. Very strong on a doctrine of predestination that quite often is very simplistic, in my mind, in the way in which it's approached, because it ends up in a kind of determinism. And in this kind of New Calvinism, Arminius is again, certainly not for the first time in history, but Arminius is again the favorite whipping boy. And Arminius is made out to be Pelagian, or at best semi-Pelagian. He's made out to have a fundamental doctrine of the free will, no doctrine of sin, no real doctrine of grace, that we basically just simply can all freely decide to be Christians whenever we decide to be Christians. Now, obviously, there's a lot of that goes around in evangelical Christianity, but my problem with that as a historian and as a theologian and as a professor of evangelism is, one, that's not who Arminius was. It's not what Arminius taught. It's not who Wesley was. It's not what Wesley taught. And so, therefore, we ought to know better. All of this is to say, well, how do you help to get that word out? My decision then was to translate Arminius' Declaration of Sentiments, which was given in 1608 in The Hague, as a kind of culmination of a whole series of times in which, since the early 1590s, Arminius had been called on the carpet for his teachings and suspicions about whether or not he truly was an Orthodox Reformed Christian. And he was vindicated over and over and over again. Ultimately, this ended up being a disputation that was given before the ministers of the country, because that's the way, not ministers in the sense of clergymen, but ministers in the sense of political leaders. Whole other stories involved there. That's the way things worked in those days. And so the mayor or the city council, or else the governors of a county, or they all had to give approval for ministers. They also had to approve ministerial teaching. I mean, this, in separation of church and state, this sounds really weird to us in the 21st century, but that's the way it was then. But Arminius, once again, was vindicated. The challenge with this particular document is that the only English version that we've had of it previously, and this is the case also even in the edition of Arminius' works that Carl Bangs re-edited, that the Nazarene Publishing House put out, is that the English translation was based on a Latin text. And the Latin text is not a text that Arminius did. The Latin text was done by a friend of Arminius's. We're not certain whom. I think I have an idea who it was, but a friend of Arminius's, and Arminius never saw the Latin text. And so the English translation is based on a Latin translation from the Dutch, but it doesn't come directly from Arminius. And my translation is based upon the Dutch document itself, which is still preserved for us. There is an archived copy that's available, and there is also a printed, transliterated version of it that was done in 1960 by Professor Hunderdahl from the University of Leiden. And so I had both a manuscript as well as the printed version with Hunderdahl's annotations and notes, and I had also a copy of the Latin text, and those were the bases that I used for making the new translation. This was preceded, that's not the only part of the book. The other thing that I did was there is a theological biography of Arminius in the early part of the book, so that when you read the Declaration of Sentiments, then you understand the context in which they were given. Otherwise, it's a strange document if you just lift it totally out of its historical context. And then finally, I conclude the book, and this is what's important for theology students, seminary students, and for pastors today, is to see that what was pushing Arminius to make his own theological statements was not just his functioning as a theologian, but his functioning as a pastor. This began during his years of being pastor of the Reformed Church in Amsterdam. And the driving impulse was for him to make clear to his parishioners what the doctrine of predestination was about, and how that it functioned, and how that it could be actually connected to a doctrine of assurance and a sense of well-being of God's Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. That is a primary pastoral driving motivation. And I think that that's extremely relevant for us at all times if we're going to have anything to say about what the New Testament says about predestination, and especially now in the early part of the 21st century when there is this revival of what's called the New Calvinism, then I think people in the Wesleyan Arminian tradition do need to have a sensible word to say about, yes, we do believe in predestination, but what we believe is that all who believe will be saved, and not that God has decided who will believe.